Okay, well, why don't we make a start? Good morning, my name's Syed Kamall. I'm a Professor of Politics and International Relations at St Mary's University in Twickenham. If you're joining us for the first time or are perhaps interested in studying at St Mary's University, we do have a wide range of programmes in business, sport, law, drama, humanities, education and theology at undergraduate and postgraduate level. St Mary's is also the #1 in London for course and teaching satisfaction in the Guardian University Guide 2020. Please go to our website for further details, www.stmarys.ac.uk. Welcome to the latest webinar from the Education, Humanities and Social Sciences faculty here at St Mary's, and that includes our Business, Law and Society. Today I'm delighted to be joined by leading Conservative thinker and commentator Nick Timothy to discuss his latest book, Remaking One Nation, The Future of Conservatism. But before I introduce Nick, can I just deal with a few housekeeping rules? We are recording this webinar and the Q&A to be broadcast later. So please do keep this in mind. We will start with the remarks from Nick, followed by a question and answer session. Feel free to submit questions during his talk, or you can wait until the Q&A session. Don't be shy. If you prefer to remain anonymous, you can select this option in the Q&A function. If you're not sure about the Q&A function, if you move your mouse or your cursor down to the bottom of the screen, you should see a chat function and a Q&A function. Please don't use the chat function for questions. Use that if you think you've got a technical problem and you want to check up whether it's our end or your end, or whether you want to post a relevant link to the discussion. After Nick has finished speaking, I'll move to the Q&A. And what I'll do is I will, depend on the number of attendees, I'll ask the question on your behalf. If we have more questions than time allows, what I'll ask you to do is to use the vote function or the thumbs up in the Q&A. That helps to rank the question, and you see a sort of scramble for the lead position, as it were, as questions rise up and down the table. And that helps me to choose the most popular questions if we're short for time. So now to our speaker, delighted to be joined by Nick Timothy, who's the author of Remaking One Nation, The Future of Conservatism. He's also the Monday columnist of the Daily Telegraph and a former Downing Street Chief of Staff. Nick, thank you very much for joining us today. Why don't I hand over to you to give us an overview or some opening remarks about your book.
Thanks, Syed, and thanks everyone for having me. What I try to do with the book is to trace the problems we have today back to the original ideas behind the policies that got us here. In particular, what I'm trying to do is explore some of the flaws in philosophical liberalism and the way liberalism has mutated into more extreme forms across the left, right, and centre of politics. And I argue that both left and right are capable of making the communitarian correction I say we need. But obviously, as a conservative myself, the book is mainly focused on how conservatives can overcome ideology and make us one nation again. Now, before anybody panics, I'm not criticising what I call in the book essential liberalism, the principles that make liberal democracy function. Essential liberalism is fundamental to our way of life. It requires not only elections to determine who govern us, but checks and balances, legal rights, independent courts, a free press, strong institutions to protect minorities from the tyranny of the majority. And it also requires support for free markets. Essential liberalism doesn't seek to turn every aspect of life into a market. It accepts that market failures happen, and it knows that public services can be run on non-market lines. But it also knows that economic freedom is closely related not only to personal freedom, but other values like dignity, justice, security, and recognition and respect from our fellow citizens. And the power of essential liberalism is that it doesn't pretend to provide a general theory of rights or justice or an ideological framework that leads towards the harmonization of human interests and values or even a single philosophical truth. It respects political diversity and allows for all manner of policy choices, from criminal justice to the tax system. And it understands that human values and interests are often in conflict. So my right to privacy might undermine your right to security, for example. A transsexual's right to be recognised as a woman might undermine the safety as women born as women. We need institutions, laws, and a limited number of legal rights to handle those conflicts. We need customs and traditions to maintain shared identities and build up trusts. maintaining the fragile balance between conflicting values and interests is a difficult thing to do, and that's why ultraliberalism can be so dangerous. Now, I think sometimes with some of the more simplistic accounts of like the liberal consensus and so on, we tend to assume that that everybody thinks the same thing in these circles. And I don't argue in the book that there is a single ultra-liberal agenda. First of all, I say there is an elite liberalism where there are beliefs shared by many members of the governing classes, but not necessarily the wider public. So this is how, despite public opposition and changes in ministers and parties in government, Britain continues with policies like mass immigration, a lightly regulated labour market, limited support for the family, and the marketisation of public services. But then we also have what I call the ultra-liberal ratchet, beliefs that are not shared across the party divide, but which keep propelling liberalism forward. So on the right, you have market fundamentalists who think mainly of the economy, and then on the left, you have left liberals who pursue their agenda of cultural liberalism and militant identity politics. One side might attempt to reverse some changes made by the other, but in the end, most remain. And market fundamentalists and left liberals end up reinforcing one another. Both have ended up leaving us with economic dislocation, social atomization, and perversely, I think, for lots of people on the right, as a bigger state that's left trying to pick up the pieces. I won't go into hugely detailed philosophical arguments in this sort of opening section, and we can go into that in the Q&A if you like, and you can certainly read more about them in the book if you buy it. But in essence, what I'm saying is, in all these forms of ultraliberalism, all these forms of ultraliberalism are flawed because they're based on a conception of humanity that isn't real. And we're suffering the consequences through the failures and the resulting policies and political programs. So I argue that we need a break with ultraliberalism in all its forms, and I tried to set out a new conservative agenda that respects personal freedom, but also demands solidarity, reforms capitalism, rebuilds community, and rejects selfishness while embracing our obligations towards others. This is obviously quite contextually relevant right now, and maybe we can talk about some of the Black Lives Matter protests, but I want to say something quite quickly about COVID and the crisis caused by the pandemic. If we listen to the language used by ministers so far through the crisis, they've been talking about a collective national effort. And when Rishi Sunak extended the furlough scheme, the Tory messaging had a heading of "We stand together." Now, the policies that have been introduced to get the country through the lockdown have included the furlough scheme, which is actually generous by international standards, emergency support for the self-employed, and grant and loan schemes for businesses. To implement and pay for these measures, ministers have embraced active government and increased public borrowing, and there hasn't been a hint of laissez-faire in the economic response to the pandemic so far. Now, it's very difficult, I think, to speak and act like this during the crisis and then afterwards say we need to return to the politics and economics and language of liberalism and individualism. I think there's every reason to believe that the Tories will persist with a more open-minded approach to fiscal policy, market interventions, and industrial strategy. Well, why do I say that? Well, I think partly that is down to the personality of the Prime Minister. I don't feel Boris is equipped to be an austerity politician. I think I said in an event with Syed recently that he likes people to compare him to Churchill, but actually the Conservative Prime Minister he reminds me of more actually is Macmillan, the Tory who accepted the post-war consensus of universal public services, a welfare state and a mixed economy. But he was also incidentally the Prime Minister who got through chancellors like nobody's business because he wanted the economy to be run hot with full employment for as long as possible. But I also make this argument because of the ways in which our politics is changing. For the last few elections, we've been experiencing a really big shift, which might amount to a lasting realignment, where the left has been picking up votes from young people, minorities, public sector workers, university towns, and the inner cities. The right has been picking up votes from the provinces, towns, and suburbs. and its new supporters are less well educated and less prosperous than before. Now, Brexit was really the catalyst for this change because it put cultural issues and questions of identity at the heart of our electoral choices, which is actually why it split parties and divided Parliament, which is obviously dominated by the professional classes from a large chunk of the public. And so Boris won in 2019 with the only electoral coalition that made sense in this context. He knew he'd lose anti-Brexit voters who previously voted Tory, and he knew he needed to find new support to win him his majority, and he won that support from working class people who had previously voted Labour. And so with this new coalition of voters, the Tories can't be the budget-cutting, state-shrinking, economically libertarian, socially liberal party they have been in recent years. They have to accept the importance of active government and public spending, hence the levelling up agenda, the emphasis on infrastructure, a greater tolerance of public borrowing, and also the economic response to the pandemic. But I also believe and hope that there's an intellectual, even philosophical basis for this change. As I say in the book, it's economic and cultural liberalism that have brought us to where we are today. Our two parties need to recognise that fact and produce something new, something different. And that's why I think we need to go all the way back to philosophy, our understanding of human nature and society, and we can build up from there.
Well, thank you very much, Nick. That's a fascinating way to start. I wonder whether, please, can I encourage people to put questions in the Q&A. Also, the fellow panelists, Kim and Emmanuel, feel free to ask questions yourself. I wonder if I could start off with a couple of things about your book appears to criticise forms of liberalism, or the extreme forms of liberalism. Let's start with two interpretations. As you know, liberalism is a wide spectrum, and even within the both ends of that spectrum, there's a wide spread of views. And here I'm thinking of what people mostly talk about: classical liberalism and modern liberalism in the modern American sense. And classical liberalism, there are a number of people who say, well, hold on a minute, it's not about anarcho-capitalism. It's not about no state. There is a role for the state. So people like Hayek, for example, saw some role for the state. Friedman talked about the role of the state in education. And then you've got modern liberals, or some people would say quite closely aligned to European social democracy. Where do you see your form of conservatism? Where does it agree with, say, classical liberalism? And where does it agree with modern liberalism, and where does it disagree with both? I wonder if people who look at current politics in terms of classical liberalism, modern liberalism.
Yeah, well, it's a very good question. I mean, the reason I talk about essential liberalism in the book rather than classical liberalism is because essential liberalism is, as I just described it, that I think the acceptance that markets are an important part of life because of the freedom that they allow, and that we need certain institutions and laws and norms that provide the checks and balances from a purer form of democracy. And many of those principles are related to classical liberalism, and most classical liberals would say, well, yes, that is what I believe. The reason I distinguish between the two is because there's this quite interesting question about when I complain about the way liberalism is interpreted and manifested in contemporary politics. Is it that these mutated forms of liberalism completely contradict classical liberalism, or is there something in classical liberalism that is somehow flawed and is related to these mutations? And actually, I think there is actually a kind of, I call it the original sin in the book, but I think there is actually a problem with some of the assumptions contained within classical liberal thinking. So if you go back to the state of nature theorists, where they say, well, let's imagine a world without any kind of government at all, and obviously it's life in that existence is pretty miserable. So humans come together and they form a social contract, which sets out the powers of the state and the freedoms of the individual. Now, the problem with doing that is that it's effectively, we'd call it a model these days, wouldn't we? It makes lots of assumptions about humanity. It doesn't, obviously the state of nature has never existed. Actually, every generation inherits rights and obligations within the society that they've been born into. So actually cultural and institutional context matters a lot to politics and policy. And liberalism, I think, actually tends to neglect that truth. It also imagines us as deeply rational individuals who are mostly motivated by maximizing our own freedom. And there's definitely a sort of a clear relationship between the way in which humans are imagined in the state of nature to the way modern economists imagine us as sort of economic maximizers. And so it has this assumption about humanity that I think is wrong, and it puts this desire for freedom as a kind of primary value, when in fact freedom is an important value, but it's one of many human values like security and justice, and the desire for recognition, and so on. And so I'm very sympathetic to much of classical liberalism, and I think liberalism in its most essential form, I think, is highly compatible with the kind of conservative agenda, I would say, that Western countries need. But I'm always slightly wary of going the whole hog with classical liberalism, because I think some of the problems that we have today they're not just that these ideas have mutated and become completely warped from the original proposition. I think some of the flaws are actually related to misconceptions in those original ideas.
And what about that turn into modern liberalism, an American context? Maybe some would say social democracy in Europe. Where do you think your ideas align with some of the more social democratic ideas?
Well, I think they sort of, I suppose they diverge and they align in different ways. So I think, when we talk about American liberalism, I think what we're talking about is, well, it's the left liberalism I talk in the book, which is effectively kind of progressive politics. And I think there's a big problem with progressive politics, which again I think is actually related to part of the logic of early liberal thinking. So there's this. I think John Gray says that. I admire John Gray very much. John Gray says that liberalism has always had two faces. There's liberalism conceived as a commitment to pluralism, which is a sort of recognition that actually there are many different human values and interests at play in a society, and those interests and values clash with one another inevitably, and in multiple different ways. And so we need to respect that inevitability. We need to have a commitment to a pluralistic society. We need to have institutions and laws and norms that protect that. But then there's a separate strand of liberalism, and John Stuart Mill is one of the people who I think does this, that says, yes, we're pluralists, but we're pluralists because pluralism allows for a kind of trial and error in society, which, combined with our rationality as humans, will inevitably lead to an ever more perfect society. And the danger with that, I think, is this is basically how liberalism becomes illiberal and intolerant. And again, I think it is actually connected to liberalism's blindness to the importance of cultural and institutional context. Because if you believe that pluralism is only really a means to progress, and it's rationality that drives you towards that progress, then whatever it is that you think is progress must be right. And people who disagree with you must, by definition, be being irrational, or they must be nefarious because they're trying to pull society back in some way. And people who cling to traditions that they value, or sort of forms of their cultural identities that they value, are somehow barbarians who need to be sort of re-educated. And you can see that playing out in all sorts of ways in modern politics, whether it's the speed with which America went to invading, it invaded Iraq in order to give it liberal democracy and ended up torturing people because they weren't quite ready for it. But it's also true in all sorts of aspects of domestic policies, whether it's about transgender rights or political attitudes to people of different religions.
It's very interesting you say that about the illiberal liberalism. When I was in the European Parliament, what was fascinating about some of the people in the liberal group at that time was a kind of their intolerance to people who didn't share their liberal ideals. And in some ways, especially with regards to faith, it was fascinating when I used to see kind of a fundamentalist secularism, if you like.
Yeah.
And they were completely intolerant to some of the more social conservatives, people who had made their views or come to their views as a result of their own faith. And they were very dismissive, and they almost thought these people shouldn't have a voice. And it's incredible how illiberal and intolerant they were. I wonder if I could ask the viewers today to submit your questions. Very pleased to see 2 questions so far. Feel free to submit more questions if you want. And if you are shy, feel free to submit your question anonymously. I'm sure, as I did a previous webinar with Nick, Nick not only asked the questions on his book, he also answered some questions about his experience of being a chief of staff in Number 10 and politics more generally. I think he answered almost every question apart from any personal grievances. But let's start with Professor John Charmley. John asks, it has been said that Mrs. Thatcher aspired to create a society in the image of her father, but ended up creating one in the image of her son. Is this part of the problem you identify? Mrs. T was not really much of a conservative.
I think that is probably one of the best quotes summing up the legacy of Thatcherism. I mean, I'm critical of some of the consequences of Thatcherism, but I do need to check my criticism because it is certainly the case that the economic policies of the decade or two before Mrs. Thatcher came to power had failed. Britain was in crisis, and some of what she did was highly necessary, but she unleashed forces that I think she didn't quite understand. I don't mean that in a sort of patronizing way, but more in a way that I think a lot of those ideas came from intellectuals' books and probably misunderstood society and social reality. So, and this is what I mean about how actually I think with ultra-liberalism there is a kind of ratchet effect where on the right they're trying to shrink the state, they're trying to marketize public services, they're trying to deregulate the labor market. They certainly won't want to countenance significant market interventions. They will tell you to wait for the invisible hand. The invisible hand may be invisible because in places it does not exist. And then on the left, you have the kind of mirror opposite on cultural matters. And I think the consequences of both are that you end up with whole communities that struggle with the effects of things like deindustrialization that happened very fast. They suffer from brain drains where their talented young people go to university in different places and never return. They have a de-skilling crisis because there's little provided by the state to provide them with skills and training, but they've also lost a lot of their major employers and smaller companies in the supply chain. And these companies have lost these communities have lost a lot of the kind of social capital and social confidence that actually capitalism rests upon. And I think that's one of the reasons why all those people waiting for the spontaneous order to produce great wealth in parts of the country that suffered that deindustrialization will be waiting a lot longer. And it's really important, therefore, that we recognize that instead of trying to think of politics as this ongoing fight where it's about, to what extent do you believe the state should be bigger, or to what extent do you think the market should be unleashed? Actually, we need to think of politics as much more of a partnership of three, where good societies, successful societies, rely on good government, which might mean sometimes active and interventionist government, a healthy market and private sector, and a strong community. And I think trying to fix the problem of the decline of community is probably one of the hardest political challenges we have before us.
It's also interesting that you say about some of the maybe unintended consequences or the legacies of Thatcherism, because I think it was David Green, when he wrote his book Reinvented Civil Society, about in the 90s, and he talked about the loss of civic virtue amongst many liberals, or classical liberals, and he was very critical of sort of what he called the hard-boiled economic rationalist of the Chicago school, who he said was hostile to any talk of social responsibility or moral obligation. And I think there are still today a number of classical liberals who feel that that has allowed their form of liberalism to be misportrayed, if you like. Let's move on to the next question, which is from my colleague, Dr. Christopher Wilde in the Politics Department. Chris, thank you very much for joining us today. He asks, is the contemporary Conservative Party in the UK ideologically conservative? If so, how? Or is it populist? Or if so, how?
Well, I mean, my view of populism is that it's not necessarily a kind of ideological creed, but rather a kind of political method. So it's about claiming that the people in positions of power are not only unrepresentative of the country, they're involved in some kind of conspiracy against the country, that they're serving narrow interests, often their own, but often those who pay for them. So you get sort of conspiracy theories, quite often conspiracy theories connected to anti-Semitism, about the people in positions of power. They attack institutions that might provide the checks and balances against their freedom of action. So they will quite often go for the judiciary, the independent press, parliamentary processes, and so on. So I think that populism is really a method, and that's one of the reasons why you actually see populism on the right and left, and actually, perversely enough, I think it's probably possible on the centre, although you see it far less. And I've certainly seen some people actually recently start to argue that elements of the New Labour years were populist, which is quite an interesting line of argument.
Well, isn't populism really a play on popular? I mean, should we always be critical of populism, as it were? It always seems to have a negative connotation, when surely what they're doing is parties are tuning them. Maybe what happens is that many people feel abandoned by the mainstream parties, and the populists offer them a refuge, however unrealistic or however simple the message is.
Well, I think on the point about does populism just mean things that are popular? I mean, I think that is part of the problem with modern political discourse, that it is true that sort of establishment parties and politicians will quite often argue that any kind of break from the consensus that they share in amounts to populism. It's unthinkable, and they'll sort of almost question the morality of it. But that's not, there are plenty of legitimate policy debates to be had. I mean, Britain can have nationalised railways if it wants. It can have no tuition fees if it wants. It could privatise the NHS if it wants. These are all legitimate things to talk about. In each of those three things, we've made decisions as a country so far, but they can be changed. But I think quite often politicians who defend the status quo are quite quick to throw the label of populist at people who question them, which is never really very healthy. But I think the point is, is the government a Conservative government? Well, I should probably answer whether I think it's a populist one first. I think there were probably elements of populist methodology in some of what the Leave campaign did. Not entirely, but in some respects, I think they did. That's obviously probably quite a lot easier to do if you're running a single issue campaign, because you're not really sort of responsible for then enacting it, because that then falls to the government. So it's probably not surprising that populism becomes more prevalent as a method in single issue referenda. But I don't think that means that the Conservative government now is populist. And we can have an argument about that if you like, but I think not. The question is, how conservative is it? And I think, what conservatism is a bit like liberalism. It can be a bit difficult to pin down. But I think it's going through a transition. And one of the things I'm trying to argue in my book is that conservatism, or conservatives over the years, have grown to believe that conservatism is liberalism, and it's not. It's much more questioning of some of the tenets of liberalism. It's much more pragmatic. It should be much more cautious about accepting any kind of ideological premises. It should be much more interested in the way we build up community. It should be much more open-minded about the role of government, especially in the economy. Now, to what extent are we seeing the Conservative Party move in a more conservative and less liberal direction? I think the jury's out on that a little bit. Certainly when I was in Downing Street, I was trying to push the party in that kind of direction. I think, what I said in my opening remarks about the way the Tory electoral coalition has changed since Brexit probably does push it in a more conservative and less liberal direction. Boris seems to have accepted the logic of that to a certain degree. That's one of the reasons why the party is much more open-minded about spending in the regions, borrowing to fund some of that spending. There was a notable market intervention just before the pandemic where the government bailed out Flybe because they said that there was a broader social case to consider rather than just the market economics of it. You can see that the party is moving in that kind of direction. The question is whether that is a lasting shift or whether the kind of instincts of many Conservatives in Parliament are likely to kick in again. And I think probably the proof point of that will be when people start to really engage with how we try to lead the economy towards recovery. Does the party then go back to being quite economically liberal? Does it go back to something that is probably, potentially more fiscally conservative? Does that mean that there will be further years of austerity? I mean, I have reason to believe that that probably won't be the case, and that they will try to stick to some of the promises they made last December. They will try to grow their way out of trouble, and they will be tolerant of an increase in the stock of debt, even though they will feel they'll need to do something about the deficit after a particular period.
We've got four questions in the chat. I know we've got plenty of time. Can other people, if you want to ask a question, if you've asked a question already, please feel free to ask a question. I will ask on your behalf. So next question is, we're seeing state intervention on a massive scale in response to COVID. We saw in 2008 in response to the financial crisis. What did we learn or not learn from that earlier intervention that could help us manage the consequences this time around? And also, who paid?
I'll make a note of the second question. So I have a habit of answering long and then.
It's not about becoming a politician, actually. It's all your years in politics.
It is. I think the first thing to say is that the situations are quite different. So the banking crisis, the financial crisis, was the bursting of a bubble. And when that happens, you realize that you were poorer than you had previously thought you were. So there's one shock. Then there is the economic consequences of the credit crunch itself. So obviously there were fiscal consequences because of the scale of the bailouts required, but then there were consequences of the lack of flow of credit, which went on to affect things like productivity and the economy, and so I think the sustained need for austerity that Osborne concluded was there is not necessarily here this time. I mean, we'll have to see how the economy recovers. It's obviously not going to be an immediate sort of V-shaped recovery, which actually the Treasury did go into the crisis believing would happen. The government's done, I think, quite a good job of making sure that that companies that had been in robust health will survive and will be able to return to some degree to normal afterwards. And so while there will be an economic hit, there will be unemployment. I think what we're likely to see from a fiscal perspective is a significant increase in the stock of debt and a deficit that will run high for a year or two, but not necessarily the same kind of ongoing huge deficit that the Cameron and Osborne government took, close on a decade to close. And the other difference is that in this situation, pretty much every Western country is going to have a massive fiscal hit coming after this because everybody is responding in a similar kind of way, which means that markets are going to, the international markets are going to look at things slightly differently. And so there is probably reason to believe that there won't be the same pressure to reduce deficits in the same way. And of course, what I should add is it was arguable as to whether the country needed to go through the austerity that it did after 2010. There might have been a case for a different level of cut, potentially more tax rises, but also a policy centred on going for growth, which I think will be Boris's instincts this time round anyway. On the question of who paid and what we learned from 2008, firstly, this will be the second time in a little more than a decade in which the taxpayer has bailed out business. Now, you can say with the banking crisis, business didn't necessarily deserve the help. The banks didn't deserve the help. They'd helped to cause the crisis, and there's some truth in that. It's not really true this time. So I'm not saying this in a way that implies that I think we should be punitive, but we should, I think, be reminded of the interdependency of business and society, and so with the taxpayer making an enormous contribution to keep certain businesses afloat, we should be, I think, asking questions about how we have some kind of new contract, new shared approach between business, governments, and society. And high up my list, apart from making sure that companies pay their taxes, high up my list would be that there would be a real partnership with proper business involvement when it comes to technical education, training, retraining, and so on. Because I don't think it can be right that the taxpayer will have twice paid for a massive bailout, and then afterwards we just allow things to go back to normal.
Looking back at the last crisis, do you think some of those who were responsible, some of the people who came up with these marvelous instruments like CDOs and CDSs, and you saw AIG financial products and other take on debt that's 2.8 trillion, which they could not afford to pay because of their accounting standards. Do you think people actually held, those who were responsible actually took responsibility and in some cases paid the price? Or do you think they got away with it? We seem to see some of the very same people who led their banks to disaster soon after the crisis bounced back, having been bailed out by taxpayers' money, asking for more help, or actually saw them receiving good bonuses, as it were. So do you think they did take responsibility? I mean, this crisis is different, but looking back at the last crisis.
No, I don't think they did. I mean, to be perfectly honest, I mean, I think in a more moral world, we might have actually seen criminal prosecutions, let alone financial penalties. The criminal prosecutions never happened, and any kind of personal, financial restraint was pretty time limited, and the bonuses returned pretty quickly. And I think this time, I was on a TV program last night where one of the other guests was Michael O'Leary from Ryanair. It's probably one of the most obnoxious people in the business world, who spent the entire interview saying that everything the government's done is completely wrong, is utterly disgusting, and that he didn't mention that he'd received a taxpayer-backed £600 million loan as a result of government policy. And he was insisting that actually aviation can just go back to normal with passengers squeezed in next to one another, and that all that would be needed was people to wear masks, and citing some very bogus science in his support. And last time round, the egregious behaviour we all focused on was the bankers, rightly, but actually there's corporate irresponsibility and pretty bad behaviour in all sorts of different companies and sectors, and I really think it is a question of important, urgent political leadership that some of that behaviour is addressed.
Maybe it also gives us some hope for some sort of consensus across the spectrum. There are people on the left and the right who did not like the irresponsible behaviour, or don't like this idea of crony capitalism, for example.
Yeah, exactly.
Let me turn, there's about 5 questions left, about 15 minutes. Let me see if I can get through them all. Question asked anonymously on, they weren't unable to use a Q&A, so they sent me a message. They say, can you ask Nick about his views on the Black Lives Matter protests? Trump calls the protesters thugs. I have 2 daughters, 22 and 18, who think that in this circumstance, violence is necessary. I find this very disturbing. What does Nick think about the need for violent protest to advance change? The suffragettes finally got the vote, but only through action, not peaceful protest. What's your own view on this, Nick?
Well, I mean, I think, firstly, the murder of George Floyd, if I can call it murder, before a jury has decided, is obviously disgusting, and I think symptomatic of some serious social problems in America, and symptomatic of problems within American police forces too. And looking at America, the thing I conclude when I look at it is there's a total lack of leadership coming from anywhere. So the cause of George Floyd and his family has been picked up by some, I think, pretty aggressive left-wing forces. They've encouraged violence. Some people have just come out and carried out acts of violence because the opportunity has been there. It's pretty similar in a way to the way people came out and looted during the London riots several years ago. There's none of the leadership of a kind of Martin Luther King figure during the civil rights protests of the 60s. Neither is there any kind of leadership coming from the president, who seems to want the confrontation. Some
say this sort of sorry to disturb you, interrupt. Some say this sort of polarization, and in terms of the Democrats going back to identity politics, as it were, actually helps Trump. Would you?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think there's a reason why he keeps tweeting law and order in capital letters, because he wants this presidential election coming up to be not a referendum on his handling of the pandemic, but a referendum on how much you hate China. And in response to this unrest, he will want it to be a referendum on law and order and not on social justice. And maybe he'll get his way. It's cynical and horrible. And my personal view is that I think he is a race baiter. And it's pretty unbelievable to watch him act in that way. And I think this is part of the problem. I mean, America hasn't really addressed its levels of inequality, and that inequality is not just racial inequality. I mean, the miserable existence in many places of the white working class was one of the things that propelled Trump to the White House in the first place. There's an opioid crisis. I mean, America has crisis layered on top of crisis, and it hasn't addressed things like long-standing problems of inequality, but also racial justice and political polarization, and so on. And so instead of there being a kind of grown-up political conversation about the ways in which America can be made a fairer place, you've got the two extremes, where you've got Trump, who's signaling some pretty nasty things, I think, but you also have people who are taking advantage of people's understandable sense of grievance. And I really dislike the way the Black Lives Matter campaign operates, because as far as I can tell, it's not pushing for specific legal changes to improve the rights of suspects or to stop the police from using certain restraint techniques or anything like that. It's asking or telling white people to get down on their knees in front of them, I think, is a very strange thing to do. And a lot of this is born from some of the philosophical developments that I talk about in the book. It comes from this very strange postmodernist tradition. I talk in the book about the way the thinking of people like Michel Foucault sort of jumped across the Atlantic from France to America and then fed into the sort of theories of intersectionality and that kind of thing. But if your view is that discourse is oppressive, that words are acts of violence, that help to keep people down, that there are oppressive hierarchies in society that we don't fully understand, they don't argue that we should try to achieve the sort of classical liberal ideal of equal political rights, which incidentally people like Martin Luther King did argue for. They actually want to turn the hierarchies upside down. If whiteness and masculinity are two of the identities that have helped to oppress people for years, then those identities must be punished. And I think it's divisive. It puts a lot of people on the back foot, and we need leadership that will help people to come together and fix real problems, because this grievance is legitimate. But no, I mean, I agree with the questioner about his concern for his daughters and their attitudes.
It's interesting. Also, George Floyd's brother himself has pleaded not to let this poor sad incident be overtaken by violence, and felt that violence actually achieves nothing. And you've seen also in some communities where people are looting shops run by other minority communities, and they say, "Well, this has nothing to do with us. We share your pain." I'm going to ask people. We've got about 3 questions left, or comments and questions. Feel free to go into Q&A and use the vote function to help me choose what question is next. Next question is from Michelle Paul. She says, "Do you think the current health crisis will lead to more pronounced ethical dimension to party economic policies? For example, greater concern with supply, closely monitored supply chains, workers' health, consideration of workers' hours, etc."
Well, I mean, if I've understood you correctly, I mean, I think it will. I think there'll be quite a lot of political and policy consequences of this crisis. There will be much more emphasis on local and national resilience. There will be calls for much greater state capacity, including the capacity of our health and social care systems. as part of both, I think there will be attempts to change the nature of supply chains so that they're less stretched and more reliable in times of crisis. That we sort of run our health system in a kind of just-in-time kind of way. There might be a little bit more emphasis on sort of resilience and capacity. Some of that might not necessarily be incredibly expensive because you might end up with kind of reservists, as it were, who come back to the health sector at times of crisis. And I think we'll also have some arguments about disparities, about health outcomes among different ethnic groups, different socioeconomic groups. And that will lead to some quite interesting arguments about public health. So obviously Public Health England has been criticised a lot for its lack of preparedness and slow responses early on in the crisis. And in some quarters for focusing too much on things like obesity. But on the other hand, obesity seems to be one of the factors that makes people more vulnerable to the virus. So I think this will affect all of those debates quite profoundly, and it's clear in some respects the direction of travel. I think on something like public health, I'm not quite sure where we will end up actually. It sounds like ministers might actually head in a slightly more interventionist direction there.
And what's very interesting about Public Health England is that actually their budget for diseases, including pandemics, actually rose while they were also spending money on things like studies of alcohol, the behaviour of football fans and their purchasing of alcohol or smoking in mosques. And people say, well, some of the critics say, well, we know these things are bad, but Public Health England had one job, to prepare us for pandemics such as this, and they failed. So interesting debate there. A couple more questions or comments. As a senior advisor, you became the news after the 2017 election. Another senior advisor has recently become the main item of the headlines. Without asking you to comment on the Durham trip, what does it tell us more generally about the relationship between politicians and advisors?
Well, I think the role of advisors is sometimes overdone. At the end of the day, you can be an influential advisor. You can be quite a powerful advisor, but you're never as powerful as the senior ministers who are supposedly sort of cowed by your words or actions. In a way, I think the media has kind of created an unwinnable game for advisors because it's decided that when advisors become the story, their position is no longer tenable. But it's obviously in the gift of the media to decide whether you're a story or not. When I was in Number 10, I kept my mouth shut. I remember having Michael Crick and a Channel 4 cameraman chasing me up Whitehall as I walked into work and not saying a word because even though I had plenty to say to his questions, because it's always been my strong view that advisors should be like Victorian children, seen, not heard. I think Dom's a little different. He gives comments as he leaves his house in the mornings. I think once you do that, you set a precedent, and then you're expected to do it. And so it becomes, you very definitely become part of the story, and it probably appears to be more willing than in my case. I think, to be honest, I think the obsession with advisors is not a good one. It's part of the kind of I think it says something about the limitations of our political discourse that we focus so much on personalities anyway, but certainly the personalities of people who for professional reasons can't answer back anyway. I think there's probably a case for, as part of much wider civil service reform, doing something about the status of special advisors, because I don't think the system really works for anybody as things stand.
Okay, well, that brings us onto our last comment from John Charmley, and I'll add a comment from someone else on that. It's John Charmley says, one of the fundamental divides between conservatism and liberalism can be summed up in Clemenceau's comment on President Wilson's proposals for the post-war settlement. So let's not forget, those were the points that led to the establishment of the League of Nations. Wilson has his 14 points. God has his 10 commandments, we shall see. Human nature is not what liberalism would like to assume it should be. And if I could just add to that, I think if it was Roger Scruton who said something like, liberals seek freedom, socialist equality, and conservatives responsibility. And without responsibility, neither freedom nor equality have any lasting value. I wonder whether you want to comment on both Clemenceau and also Scruton as well.
Well, I think the Scruton quote is perfect. I didn't know the Clemenceau quote. There's another one I think that David Willits quite likes to quote, which is I actually forget the original source, which I think it might have been Quentin Hogg, said liberalism is very nearly right. I disagree. I think it's further away from right than certain conservatives think it is. But I don't think conservatism is a wholesale rejection of liberal values. As Scruton also said that modern conservatism arose as a kind of hesitation, a kind of correction to liberalism. I think there's some truth in that. But I think as liberalism has changed and evolved over the years, mutated in some cases, it's got further away from conservative values.
Well, Nick, this has been fascinating. We're coming up to the hour, so I think we'll end it there. Thank you very much for joining us today. Thank you also very much for all the viewers and listeners who joined us today. If I could just make a couple of plugs. Our next webinar will be tomorrow at 11 o'clock. The subject will be the New World Order after Coronavirus. Will the pandemic accelerate China's dominance on the world stage? That will be with Sir Martin Donnelly and with Will Hutton. Please do join us at 11 o'clock tomorrow for that. Our next EHS webinar will be with Dr. Kim Salmons and Jenny Fogarty on representations in literature at 1 o'clock next Thursday. Thank you all for joining us today. Don't forget, if you're interested in learning more about St Mary's University, we have a wide range of programs in business, sport, law, drama, humanities, education, theology at undergraduate and postgraduate level. More information can be found on our website, www.stmarys.ac.uk. You can also follow us on Twitter and Facebook at Your St Mary's, as well as on LinkedIn. Thank you for joining us today. Please stay safe, and we hope to see you again soon. And Nick, thank you very much.
Thank you very much.